Hello, in this video we will be talking about middleware. Middleware is one of the core functionality of any ASP.NET Core web application. When we send the request from browser to the server, then the concept like middleware comes into the picture, and let's see how middleware works in the application. As you can see in the diagram, a browser is sending a request to the server, and let's suppose we have deployed one ASP.NET Core web application on this server, right? And after receiving the request to the server, the request basically goes to the controller, what we think. And in the controller, that basically goes to the particular action method, and that particular action method decide whether it has to give response in HTML, JSON, or any other file, and it give the response back in the form of HTML to the browser. This is the cycle that we think. But in reality, what is happening behind the scene when the browser is sending a request to the server, before hitting it to the controller, the request goes through this pipeline. So the request firstly it will go through the pipeline. When the processing is completed in this pipeline, then the request goes to the controller, and the rest of the cycle is same as we have discussed, right? So let's understand about pipeline first. So let's talk about this pipeline first, this request pipeline. Moving to the next slide, as you can see in the diagram, remember one thing that ASP.NET Core web application can have n number of middlewares, right? We can have n number of middlewares according to our need, right? And in the diagram, we can see that a client is sending the request to this request pipeline, right? And this request pipeline is having n number of middlewares. We can see middleware 1, 2, 3, and many more we can create according to our need. But as of now, you understand in this request pipeline, we are having these three middlewares, right? We are having these three middlewares. We can see this, these three middlewares we are having in this request pipeline, right? So, let's assume that a client is sending the request to this request pipeline, and uh, in this, the request will first go to this middleware one, and in this middleware one, we have written some code, right? So first of all, it will execute those code, and we have written the next method. So after executing all codes in the middleware one, then the control will go back to the next middleware. You can see in the diagram. So as soon as control will find the next method, the control will switch to the next middleware. Again, in the second middleware, it will execute the code, and after executing the code, if next method the control finds, then the request will travel to the next middleware. In this third middleware, after executing the code, um, we are having no any next method. So after executing this code, the request will come back to the middleware 2, right? And it will execute the remaining code in the middleware 2 if it might have or it might have not, right? Depending on the need and the situation, right? So let's suppose after executing the remaining code in this middleware 2, then the control will come back to the middleware 1. And the same thing, it is executing the remaining code in the middleware 1, and it will give the response back to the client. So this is how basically your request pipeline work, right? So in a single line, we can say that middleware is nothing. Middleware is a bundle of lines, or we can say it's a bundle of few. We can say few lines of code that has to be executed in your application, right? So remember one more thing, I'm telling it again, that any application, any ASP.NET Core web application can have n number of middlewares according to our need, right? So this is basically a kind of functionality that we implement in our application in the form of middleware, right? So let's discuss finally some more definition about middleware that we have discussed in this diagram. So moving to the next slide, we can say that middleware is a piece of code that is used in the HTTP request pipeline. An ASP.NET Core web application can have n number of middlewares that we have already discussed, and we have saw in the diagram in this, right? And Based on the functionality, according to our need, we can implement a number of middlewares. Remember one more thing, that there are some predefined inbuilt middlewares in the application that we can use, and we can also create our custom middleware according to our need in the application, right? But the most important thing is that the order of middleware matters a lot in the execution, right? Here we can see some few examples of middlewares that where we can implement these middlewares. We can implement it in routing, authentication, or while adding any exception piece, and many more. According to our need, we can customize it and we can create our own middleware in the application. So any request coming to the controller first, uh, let's suppose if we are sending any request from client to the server, so the request will not go to the controller first. It will go through these middlewares. Let's assume that we have implemented these middlewares in our application, routing, authentication, right? So the request going to the controller first, it will go through this routing, and then it will check for the authentication, whether we want to give the specific permission to that particular user. So it has to go through all these middlewares, and then the control will hit to the particular controller and the action method corresponding to that, right? So let's switch to the application and Visual Studio. So I'm using the previous example that we have used in the previous video. So let's move to the our startup class. And in this startup class, we can see we are having these two methods: configure services and configure, right? Remember one thing, that this configure method is must for any ASP.NET Core web application when we are dealing with the services and the middleware, right? Your application will not run without this method, and the name of the method should be configure to run the application. Now let's talk about the middleware. So we can see in this method, in this configure method, so you understand that whatever code we have written in this configure method, or whatever code we are going to write in this configure method, all these are the middleware, right? So in this method, we can see this app.useDeveloper exception page. This is an middleware, right? Then app.useRouting, this is also an middleware. And then finally we have app.useEndpoint. This is also an example of middleware, and we can customize it according to our need. And if you see the order of execution, as I told you that the order of execution in the middleware, that matters a lot. So I have used routing first, and then we have used this use endpoints. Let's suppose if I use app.use endpoints first, and after that if I use this app.use routing, then the application will throw an exception, right? So we need to keep this thing in mind. We need to keep we can say we need to remember this point, that your order of execution in the middleware, the that sequence should be correct. We have already discussed that order of middleware matters a lot in execution. So that's why this your sequence of execution of middleware, that should be correct, right?